Hi, and welcome back to the Virtuoso tutorial series. Over the next few lessons, we're going to be creating a welder object that we can use to learn a little more about how interactable objects and interaction areas work. We'll be creating a welder so that we can weld a steel plate over the opening in this filter box. In real life, this wouldn't be really great practice, as you'll probably need to change the filter again, but it is pretty good for showing off how to create some interesting interactions. Let's begin by creating our welder interactable object. So if you navigate to the Assets, Tutorial Assets, Prefabs, Space Station folder, you should find this welder object. Go ahead and drag it into the scene and position it so that you can reach it when you have your VR headset on. Go ahead and position this welder so that it's comfortable to grab for you. Next, let's put the interactable object component onto the welder. So let's check is grabbable, uncheck hold button to grab, and also check the is usable box. Next, let's add a rigid body. And we're going to want to set that to is kinematic so it doesn't float away on its own. And then let's add some box colliders. I'm going to set up one box collider to encompass the barrel of the welder and another box collider to cover the handle. Make sure while you're doing this that you bring the front of the box collider out beyond the tip of the welder. That will make it easier to use the interaction later on. When creating these box colliders, don't worry about being exact. It's better to make it too easy to grab than too hard for right now. Now that we have the basic grab functionality set up, let's go ahead and enter play mode. So when you first enter play mode and try to grab the welder, you'll notice that it grabs at a sort of uncomfortable angle. We are going to fix this issue with what's called a grab point. A grab point is an object that tells the interactable object where it should be grabbed from, and that can be used to correct issues with position or angle on your interactable objects when you go to grab them. So start by creating an empty child of the welder, and I'm just going to name this grab point. So next, let's look at where this is positioned. So if you look at this grab point object, in this default position, you'll see that the z-axis is actually pointing out to the right. In general, we want our z-axis pointing forwards in order to align with the forwards on our welder here. So I'm just going to rotate it by -90 in the y direction. That's the only adjustment that my welder needs, but if you're using a different controller, you might need to make further adjustments for it to feel comfortable. If so, you can move the transform up and down or rotate it further as desired. Next, let's go back to the welder object and add a grab attach script. And we're going to go with the child of controller grab attach. Grab attach scripts control how interactable objects are connected to your controllers when you grab them. In general, you're going to want to use either child of controller grab a point or fixed joint attach point. Either one is pretty useful for 90% of applications. So to set this up, all we have to do is take the child of controller grab attach script and drop it into the grab attach mechanic script of the interactable object. Then we're going to grab our grab point and drop it into the right snap handle. So by default, no matter which controller you grab it with, if there's only one grab point in either the right snap handle or the left snap handle field, it'll use that point. But you can, if you want, set separate grab points for the left and right hands. So now let's save our scene and go back into play mode and see if that's any better. This new grab point is a lot better for me. I know you can't see my hands, but now when I point the controller forward, the welder also points forward. So if you play around with this scene a little bit, you may begin to notice some very odd behavior. If you take the welder and put it into the CO2 scrubber box, it will sort of snap into place and then continue to follow around the controller, and this is weird and not what we want. So an easy way to avoid unintended interactions is to create what are called policy lists. We can go over these in more detail at another time, but think of policy lists as a way to say which types of objects can interact with which types of interaction areas. So first, let's go to the CO2 scrubber box and add a policy list script. Then, drag the policy list into the policy list field of the interaction area. Change the type to include, and for the tag, let's put filter. So effectively, what this script is saying is that if an object has the tag filter on it, it can interact with this interaction area, and otherwise it can't. So let's go over to our filter and add a tag to it. So to add a tag, first we have to create the tag. So click Add Tag, the plus sign, filter. Then go back to the filter again, scroll down on the tag field, and select filter. So now let's go back into play mode and just confirm that the filter can still interact with the interaction area, but the welder cannot. Now that we've set up the basic grab functionality on our welder, let's make it a little more interactive by adding a particle effect whenever you pull the trigger so that it looks like the welder is on. So I've gone ahead and created a particle effect for you that you can find in Assets, Tutorial Assets, Prefab Space Station called Welder Particle Effect. Let's start by adding the welder particle effect from the Assets, Tutorial Assets, Prefab Space Station folder to the hierarchy. So grab this welder particle effect and place it as a child of the welder object. Now you're going to want to take it and reposition it so that it roughly lines up with the tip of the welder. Just to double check that the position is right, I'm going to turn on this particle effect and see how it looks. So it should be positioned right about here. Okay, next we're going to deactivate this object. Next we're going to want to set up some interactions that trigger when the trigger on the controller is pulled. We're going to manage this using a pair of Unity event reactions. So let's start by creating an empty object under the welder and name this Trigger on Events. Next, we're going to add a Unity event reaction component. So this reaction is really flexible because it uses Unity's built-in event system. You can use this to invoke methods on a lot of different objects in the scene, but for now, we're going to keep it simple and use it to turn the particle effect system on and off. So start by pressing the plus button to add to the list. Grab the welder particle effect root object, which should be disabled at this point. Go to game object, set active, and check the box for true. Then we're going to duplicate this by pressing Ctrl and D, and we're going to name it trigger off events and set that value to be false so that when the user stops using the trigger, the particle system is disabled. Okay, we're almost there. Next, let's add a reactor to the welder object. Drag the VRTK interactable object into the event sender on the reactor. The pair of events we're going to be looking for are interactable object used and interactable object unused. So this can be a little confusing because there's also interactable object use finished, but that is only used for custom object types that specifically trigger that event. In normal usage, interactable object used is called when you pull the trigger, and interactable object used is called when you stop pulling the trigger. So for each of these, let's expand it, hit the plus sign, and drag in the corresponding event. Okay, now let's save our scene and see this in action in play mode. So if we reach out and we grab the welder using the controller and then pull the trigger while holding it, we should see sparks coming out of the end of the welder. Hopefully this lesson was useful and showed you how to create some more basic effects using interactions. So now that we have the basic functionality of the welder working, that just about wraps up this lesson. In the next lesson, we'll be going over how to use an advanced interaction area to complete the welding interaction.